name that you used at Wesley House,
Yeah, that's
because
fine. Yeah.
he does a post production full intro of who you are, so that
Okay,
I
that's
just get
fine.
to welcome you.
That's absolutely fine. Absolutely
Okay,
fine.
excellent. Well, if we're ready, Kurt, we'll get. Okay. Well, Chris, I wanted to first say thank you for being willing to join me on the podcast. I'm
My pleasure.
excited. I'm really excited that our listeners get to listen in on this conversation because I had an opportunity to hear your presentation while in Cambridge, and it still is ruminating within me. So I'm excited for you to share with them today.
And well, thank you for the invitation. I'm pleased to be able to have a conversation.
So as we get started, I'm going to start there with your research. So
Of course, yeah.
your lecture was titled "Life on the Breadline: A Faith That Can Transform a Faith That Transforms Structural Injustice." And I thought it was a really good challenge for people of faith to think about the ways that we are engaged in justice ministries. So could you provide for those who weren't at the lecture an overview of your research and the way that that can help us evaluate our ministries?
Okay, thank you. Well, if I take a step back and talk a little bit about the research project from which the presentation arose, I think that might help and might
Perfect.
respond to both of your points. Um, the research project was entitled "Life on the Breadline: Christianity, Politics, and Poverty in an Age of Austerity," and it was an attempt to explore how the church is responding in a UK context. I have to stress that because it was
Hmm.
focused on primary research, but we can come to that in a moment. How the church was responding in the UK between the financial crash of 2007-8 and the so-called age of austerity that followed, particularly in the UK, with the imposition of very, very, very kind of heavy um, austerity policies by successive Conservative governments. So we're talking the period between about 2008 and around about 2021, 22, that kind of decade. And so we wanted to kind of ring fence it because there are lots and lots of studies of the church and poverty. There are lots and lots of broad based, very generalized studies about a Christian attitude to poverty, or the Bible and poverty, or theology and poverty. What we wanted to do was to do something much more specific and much more concrete and much more rooted and much more contextualized by kind of it's a false exercise in some respects, but by drawing a line around the period that we wanted to study so that we
Hmm.
could do things in a little bit more particularity. And so that's the first thing we wanted to do, to explore the ways in which the church in the UK responded to growing levels of poverty and inequality since the financial crash. The second thing we wanted to do was to develop, and we might come onto this a little bit later, but to develop an interdisciplinary approach to the study itself for two reasons. Firstly, because from my own background, I recognised that if we're going to engage as theologians, as academics, as people of faith, as the church, with this complex thing called poverty, we need to recognize that this is something that's multidimensional. We need to find a way of developing a holistic understanding of
Hmm.
poverty, which is often reduced to simply to food, so-called food poverty or food
Right.
banks, but is much bigger and more complex. And so, in order to do that, we felt it was important to draw on the insights of our social science colleagues who are much more attuned to in depth social research, in depth primary research, in depth extended fieldwork than theologians. And so, by engaging in extended field work by drawing on insights from social geography, from political sociology, from cultural studies, from political theory. We tried to develop a kind of a rounded, in-depth understanding of the context within which the church was responding, of the systemic causes of the poverty, and that then helped us to develop the first, Life on the Breadline was the first major project by UK theologians to explore the church's response to contemporary poverty in the UK. And just in a nutshell, what we discovered over a 3-year project was that, well, a couple of things really, I suppose, just in brief. Firstly, for a whole variety of historical and political and cultural reasons, it became clear that the church has been, and arguably still is, in the vanguard of responses to growing levels of poverty and inequality in the UK. We can talk a bit more about why that might be. But that's the first thing. I think as the state has withdrawn largely, and many public institutions have closed or pulled out of poor communities, it's often only communities of faith that remain. So I think there is a presence that the church has. We could ask, what does the church do with that presence? But one of the things it's done has been in the vanguard of responses to poverty in the UK. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, we wanted in our case studies to try and reflect different Christian approaches to poverty and different, what you might call, faces of poverty, aspects of poverty. And what we encountered were 4 broad approaches to the Christian response to poverty. Now, none of these are kind of hermetically sealed boxes.
Right.
They're fluid and they converge and they evolve, but they do reflect, I think, broad traditions of social ethics and missiology and theology, and broad approaches to the church's role in the public sphere, the church's role in politics, welfare. So firstly, you've got very much pastoral care focused, individually focused, caring response, the kind of the commonly understood kind of Matthew 25 approach to love your neighbour, servanthood kind of approach, which has immense value, and that could be exemplified by soup kitchens, or breakfast clubs, or lunch clubs, or food banks, for example. Lots of strengths, but maybe not perfect. But then there's another approach which is coming more from a kind of a theologically and politically radical perspective, which emphasizes social justice over welfare, as it were. And that's what we call the campaigning and advocacy approach. Now, that's maybe a bit of a double-header approach, because arguably you need to be in a position of power to be able to advocate on behalf of people perhaps who have less power. When I think of advocacy, I think more of kind of church leaders speaking truth to power, as it were. But it's that broad campaigning and advocacy approach aligned with the social gospel aspects of Catholic social teaching, strongly aligned with kind of some of the core themes within different theologies of liberation. Examples would be campaigns for housing justice or a living wage. And then the third of the 4 approaches we called self-help and enterprise, which is more of a small c conservative Christian approach, often supported in a UK context by evangelical and Pentecostal traditions. Emphasis on individual empowerment, on the importance of education and enterprise, be it social or business, as a vehicle for enhancing people's agency and enabling them to find work their own way, as it were, out of a
Right.
situation of poverty.
Hmm.
There are strengths to that approach, and it's very easy for some Christians, such as myself, who probably would describe myself as a Christian socialist, to maybe to kind of look down on that approach and to kind of say, oh, that's very much kind of a it's just a few steps from a prosperity gospel kind of pray in the right way in the right place at the right time and God will give you your BMW kind of approach, which would be an unfair characterization. But there is a tendency, I think, in the enterprise and self help approach to to ref, to perhaps neglect the fact that for every individual or group of individuals that arise from poverty out through their enterprise or through education, there are thousands of people who do not, and the structures of inequality remain in place. And then the final approach, which is arguably kind of the most incarnational of the four approaches that we encountered, we call community building, based very much on asset based community development approaches to church engagement in local communities, begins very much with notions of um, people as assets, drawing on their gifts. I think the kind of fairly corny quote is kind of we begin with what is strong and not with what is wrong. And that's about being rooted and long term in a community. And I'll
That
stop
may
there
be
because I
corny, but I like it. We
it's
start with what
maybe
is
corny.
strong.
It's maybe corny because it's right. I think
Yeah.
there are a lot of strengths about the community building approach. It, I think, quite rightly points the finger at some top down caring and campaigning approaches that seem to be aimed at a quick fix, seem to rely on outside activists or kind of saviors riding in on their horse and then kind of
Right. Yep.
galloping back again to the
Back.
suburbs.
Yes.
And I think the downside potentially is that, and it does rely on a kind of an in-depth, long-term commitment to a community, and it is about kind of negating and subverting the cultures of blame and shame that can surround poverty and inequality, blaming people who are in poverty for being poor, kind of thing. I think one of the potential downsides, as with caring,
Mhm.
is the question of whether community building, however much it might be a valuable approach, is able to handle the systemic and structural injustices that are the result of macroeconomics or macro policies that are beyond the rooted localized community building. So maybe we need something that's kind of a community building plus approach.
Yeah. And that's yes, and that's actually why even though your research is rooted in the UK, I think it has application outside of the UK. In fact, as you were presenting, you could have easily been talking about the United States, right? And we're
Sure.
starting to see actual research right now on cuts to our social welfare
Yeah. Yeah.
and the impacts of those cuts, especially on families. Most of the research I've seen right now is on families. So, can you share a little bit more about how
Sure.
your research can help us evaluate the systemic nature of poverty and how the structures, the microstructures, structures kind of continue to keep people impoverished?
No, thank you. I mean, I think you're right. That whilst the work that we've done is rooted in a UK context, and I wouldn't make the mistake that sometimes some researchers do of generalising and saying because we encountered X in our research. Therefore, it applies everywhere, in all times and all places. I do think, as you imply, though, that it's possible to kind of draw lessons and for insights and reflections to kind of resonate. I think one of those is to do with the systemic nature of poverty. Two, maybe three things to say. I think the first thing to say is that our former the most senior Treasury officer in the UK, back in 2010, just as the age of austerity was kicking in, talked about the beginning of government cuts, talked about cuts to welfare, cuts to spending on health, cuts to spending on work with on housing, on social housing, on children's services, and claimed, his phrase was, we are all in this together. We've all got to sacrifice for the greater good, but we've all got to roll our sleeves up, and we're all in this together, was his phrase. Now, it rang hollow, even at the time, to see a very, very privileged white guy claiming that his lot was the same as everybody else's.
Right.
But the evidence became clear as the decade wore on, because the truth of the matter was that we clearly were not in this together. Some people who looked and sounded and spoke like me were less hard hit by austerity policies than others. So women, black and brown Britons, people with disabilities, young people, single parents tended to be hit far harder by austerity policies than others. So that's the first thing to say, when it's not a level playing field. The
It's
second
not.
thing I think to say, and so I think the church needs to recognise that we are not seeking to clothe the hungry, clothe the naked, feed the hungry, welcome the stranger, in an equal kind of world. We are needing to recognise that things aren't equal, things aren't fair, and that, I think, is something that draws Christians into an often uncomfortable question about politics. We're all in favour of, in inverted commas, feeding the poor. But if we ask, it's that classic quote from Helder Camara, I mean, people call me a saint when I feed the poor, they call me a communist when I ask why they were poor in the first place. But that's another issue I think that we might come on to. But the second thing I would say is that whilst we reduce poverty to kind of single issues, we need to recognise that it's multidimensional. It's Martin Luther King, when he was receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, compared poverty to an octopus with many different tentacles.
Yes.
In our Life on the Breadline research, we've compared it to a jigsaw with lots of different interlocking kind of faces. So you have child poverty, you have food poverty, you have housing injustice, you have poor housing, you have low pay, you have personal debt, you have food insecurity, you have fuel poverty, and they all kind of intersect. And so if we were to go to a food bank, say, and we were to receive a food parcel, that is welcome, that is wonderful. And that is a gracious offering from the people who are working at the food bank. But if I go home and I'm living in poor quality housing where I can't afford to pay the gas bill and so can't cook the food that I've received, or it becomes less easy. We need to address, or if I can't afford because my pay is low or I'm on 0 hours contract. So I think we need to recognise the complexity of poverty, and if we're going to respond to kind of what you might call 3D poverty, we need to respond in a 3D kind of way, as it were. And I think part of that, to come on to the third point, is a recognition that our politicians, and still dare I say it, our preachers, are guilty to a large degree of still individualizing and moralizing poverty.
Yes.
We've grown out of a history where we speak about people as vagrants, the idle poor. We talk about the deserving and the undeserving poor. More recently, in a UK context, politicians have talked about people as skivers or strivers. So we individualize and moralize poverty and blame individuals who are living in poverty for being poor because because they're lazy, or they spend all of their welfare on booze and fags, or because they don't have any good role models, or because they're morally inadequate, in inverted commas, all of those kind of stereotypes. And as a church, we claim to have grown beyond those stereotypes, but I think they
Right.
still infect us.
I believe, yes. And in fact, I used some of your research in a sermon that I just delivered as a guest preacher this past week. I used Matthew 25, and I actually had looked at this church's website to see that they had a food bank, they had a school supply drive, but it was
Yeah.
all that individualistic. And so I made the challenge similar to what you just offered of looking at why does this continue to be an issue in our community? And someone at the door actually said to me, "You went from preaching to meddling." And I
Yeah.
said, "Maybe, yeah, maybe a little bit." Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and and so, like you said, sometimes this can be difficult for our churches that think that faith and politics should be separate.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
and,
Yeah.
and so for those of us that are preaching this or trying to teach this way, how can you help laity and clergy alike to kind of
Yeah.
embrace this concept and this vision?
I think the first thing I would say is that it's not just a US problem. We found exactly those kind of conversations and responses in our research, which covered England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, and across a range of different Christian traditions, from Roman Catholic through to Pentecostal and everything in between. Significant numbers of people framed the church's engagement with poverty as an act of servanthood, as an act of loving their neighbour, as an act of charity, and resisted campaigning work because they felt that was too political and that therefore was too controversial. So it's not just a problem for the US. I think we've got the same problem here as well. Um, how do we overcome it? In some senses, I think we need. I think to a degree, eloquent preachers and politicians and theologians can raise awareness and convict and persuade, but ultimately, I think nothing beats actually seeing things for ourselves. Now, I don't know what that means in practice, but I think that where we experience something, it kind of it hits us in a new kind of deeper sort of way. It becomes more visceral, I suppose. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, but I think that we need to listen to one another's stories. We need to move beyond the kind of it's an awful phrase, so forgive me, but it's very evocative. Social scientists talk about, those kind of videos or those films where they are kind of, they're either about making people in poverty look lazy good for nothings, or they're making people with money feel sorry for people who are living in poverty. They're they're the kind of films that show kind of people who are living in poverty, and aid development organisations have used them in the past, and it's sometimes referred to as poverty porn. because it is intended to elicit a kind of a visceral response, and it's quite voyeuristic, and so there's a danger, I think, that that can happen. But I think wherever possible, we need to listen to people who are experienced with living in poverty. We need to recognize, I think, that when people talk about the fact that, to give an example, one of the case studies that we did in our Life on the Breadline project was of an appalling fire called the Grenfell in a place in high multi-story housing apartments called Grenfell Tower in North London, and 72 people died in the fire. But a couple of miles away, there were people in a very, very wealthy part of London living in similar accommodation, who were very affluent. Now, they would never have been allowed, if that fire had happened in South Kensington rather than North Kensington, there would have been a national outcry, and it would have been a national emergency. And that's, I think, a recognition. When you tell stories like that, there is a recognition that there are political factors at play. We're not all in it together. There are differences that policies make in relation to housing, in relation to health, in relation to education, in relation to employment, and those are political matters. And so I think that there is an education that needs to be done. I think then we need perhaps to look afresh at the Gospels and say, okay, right, you are hesitant for the church to get involved in what you're referring to as politics. But let's look at the teaching of the prophets. Let's look at the ways in which Jeremiah and Amos and Isaiah speak about inequality and not just poverty. They talk about the politics of Palestine. Let's look at the way in which Jesus doesn't just feed those hungry 5,000, doesn't just care for those in need, but actually goes into that temple and turns over the tables because the poor were being oppressed. We look at the implications of Jesus' challenge to his disciples in Matthew 25. And it's very easy to dumb that down and say that it's very much just about charity. But if we are challenged by the person of Jesus to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, welcome the stranger, in a society where those with power allow the poor to go hungry, the homeless to remain homeless, and the strangers to be rejected, then inevitably what we are doing becomes a political act. And there is no doubt that there is a challenge. There's absolutely a challenge, but ultimately it's the challenge of the gospel, and it's a challenge of remaining open to the teaching of Jesus and the experience of those living in poverty.
So that's fantastic, and I think is a challenge, right? And and so a little bit of that is looking to the other disciplines and to say, you know, in political science, you would never do this research outside of communities, right? Or, I was a sociology undergrad, and the presence was something that we used to do all the time, right? Like we would go into communities, just sit and evaluate. What would you recommend? Yes. Yep. Yes.
The sound was coming and going. Yeah.
Okay. I'm
Can you tell where I'm coming from? Are you able to? I'm coming from my phone, not from the computer.
That's clear,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna try to. Now I've got to remember where I was though, Kurt. I
Being rooted in
Perfect.
communities, I think it
Excellent.
was. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all. So I was a sociology major in undergrad,
Mhm.
and I had the opportunity to engage in studies where we were just there to observe,
Mm.
to interact. And so, as a sociology major, I could never imagine um, not doing this work while engaging with the community.
Yes,
But
yes.
so often in churches, I've been in settings where we don't do the deep listening that you were
Mm, mm,
just
mm,
advocating for. We
mm,
look around at our community and we say, what does this community need? Oh, a food bank. We'll create a food bank.
mm,
And so, how can we help churches and theologians in general
mm, mm,
learn from other disciplines and to um, integrate the work that we're doing with one another as we collaborate with other academics, other disciplines, other schools of thought outside of theology?
mm. I mean, you're preaching to the choir, you really are. And I would share everything that you just said. I think it's essential. Let's start here. It's essential, I think, for let me just use the phrase academic theologians. It's essential for academic theologians and church-based theologians, I think, to to who are speaking about contemporary social issues, contemporary social challenges such as poverty and inequality, racism, and to be rooted in local communities. There is a tradition, isn't there, within theology, of awesome, amazing, prophetic, literature based textual study that remains, I think, the dominant tradition within academic theology. The kind of some of the greatest political theologians and liberation theologians and feminist theologians of recent decades have remained working in their libraries and in their studies and have been reflecting on the ideas and the texts and the arguments of other theologians and on the lessons to be drawn from the scriptures. And that's valuable, but I think it's limited, if I could be a bit judgmental. I think that there is a limit to what we can learn if we don't get outside of our library and get down and dirty, as it were, in local communities. We can reflect on the why. We can reflect on the ethics. We can reflect on the values that shape different attitudes towards poverty and the church's role in the public sphere and religion and politics and all of those questions. But unless we actually learn from our social science colleagues and get serious about understanding the systems and the structures and the practices and the policies that shape the lives and the experiences of those without power and those with power, we're never, ever, ever going to develop a holistic understanding of the factors that cause and shape and can defeat structural injustice, poverty, and inequality. So if theologians are fantastic at answering the why question, perhaps we need to recognise that our social science colleagues are an awful lot better at answering the what, the who, the where, the how kinds of questions. I think we need each other. And in terms of the church, I think that there has been, or there can be a kind of a, I think it can come in a couple of guises. I think there can be an anti-intellectualism, a kind of a suspicion of kind of the of, I don't know, of secular researchers who are not necessarily people of faith, although they may be, but they're not premising their exploration of poverty or inequality or racism or whatever it might be on documents of faith. They are exploring what goes on in people's lives, what the factors are that shape the experience of people who are living with poverty, and
Mhm.
trying to understand those factors and recognizing that those factors evolve and change. So, for example, you gave the example of a church meaning well, caring, but perhaps being slightly removed from the kind of the rawness of deep poverty, wanting to do the right thing, so opening a food bank. I worked a number of years ago in a church in the UK, and there was a similar kind of ethic. And a few years earlier, people had decided to open a shop that sold very, very, very low priced kind of clothing because there were issues with people not having enough clothes, and that was okay, and it met a need.
Uh-huh.
But then gradually, we began to see more and more charity shops, more and more low price new shops. So as retailers were able to access and source very cheap new clothing, the need for a church-based charity shop became it became redundant because people didn't need hand-me-downs anymore because they could buy new clothes for exactly the
Right.
same amount of money. So
Hmm.
why buy a hand-me-down when you can get something new for the same price? But the church, I think, wasn't quite able to grasp that the goalposts had moved, that the principles remained the same, wanting to meet the needs of those who were living on the edge. But the reality was that the experience of those living on the edge had changed.
Right.
So there's a need, I think. What's Jesus' phrase about those who have ears to hear? I think we need
We
to
need to
open our
listen.
eyes and open our ears and listen and be ready to act on what we hear. And sometimes acting on what we hear might mean a recognition that the church on its own cannot, in its own strength, do what it feels is needed. It might be the kind of what we learn is we need to work alongside other people of goodwill to bring our strengths and our witness and our capabilities, and to bring them together with others who have got different gifts and different strengths. But I don't know how willing people are to change or
Well, and
listen.
I think that that is, back to your earlier response about the, coming in from the suburbs to do a mission and then doing it and feeling good and leaving. That's one of the challenges of that model of ministry, right? Is you're not getting to
Absolutely.
relationships. You're doing it almost to say, okay, I got that check mark. I did my good deed.
Yeah,
And
100%.
that is so contrary to what you're talking about with the community building and the community building capital. And I
Yeah.
think that that link between that community building and the political capital that you link in your research is an important thing for churches to remember, the listening, the
I
relationship.
yeah, I mean, I no, absolutely. I mean, I think I mean, three things, I suppose. First, there can be a tendency within many Christian traditions to to put the institutional church first, to look after buildings and congregations, and put an overwhelming focus on growing worshipping congregations. And those things are important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not dismissing them, but I think sometimes when difficult decisions have to be made, that can mean that projects and congregations and churches in poor communities, whether they be urban or rural, can tend to be the ones that get closed first.
Yes.
The church can withdraw from communities in need because it's safer. And one of my friends, a guy called Robert Beckford, who pioneered black liberation theology in the UK, spoke as a Pentecostal himself about what he refers to as three temptations when it comes to the church's role in, well, we could call it community development, we could call it social justice, we could call it politics. Robert talks about the fact that the church is tempted to can sometimes be scared out. It's scared off.
Scared out. Okay.
Scared
Yeah.
out, and it can be bought out. So, in other words, exchanging a prophetic ministry for grants to support its much more consensual youth and community work. So you get a grant to support a breakfast club for young children or a lunch club for elderly people. But implicitly, when you get that grant, the expectation is that you're not going to jump up and down and shout about kind of the fact that people are being paid below a living wage kind of thing.
Sure. Yep.
So you get bought out. And then the third point Robert makes is that people can, he says, can sell out, can be sold out. So there's a sense here where he's talking about the appeal of what he refers to as a materialistic gospel, and that's where I think we get a kind of the preaching of materialism and material blessing and material prosperity as a way out of poverty. That's God's blessing, material wealth and material blessing. And poverty, therefore, becomes a sign of God's displeasure, or, heaven forbid, a curse. And so Robert says that there are temptations that kind of prevent the church from engaging with these issues. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is to recognise that there is a big decision that churches have to make. The truth of the matter is, going back to what I said a little earlier, that in a UK context, and I don't know the US anywhere near as well, but I'm guessing in a US context, churches often remain in local communities when other public and statutory agencies withdraw. They are rooted in local communities, they are embedded in local communities. In many, many cases, they've been there for generations. They have credibility and respect and are trusted and have been alongside people through the tough times and the hard times and the tragic times of people and communities' lives. They have credibility, if you like. And those relationships and those networks and that influence is often referred to as social capital. And so what does the church do with that influence, with that social capital? That's the key question. I think in a UK context, successive governments have sought to draw on faith communities, not just Christian communities, but Muslim communities as well in certain parts of the UK, to encourage them, to persuade them to essentially become welfare delivery agencies, delivering the government's social agendas, using government money to provide welfare. And there is a prophetic question that needs to be asked there. I mean, does the church, is it part of the church's calling to support the government, be that local, regional, or national, in caring for all those who are in need, even if the church completely disagrees with the policies of a particular government? Or is there a calling on the part of the church to exert that prophetic ministry of speaking truth to power and challenging what it believes are the unjust policies and pronouncements of prime ministers and presidents, be they Andy Burnham over here or Donald Trump in your neck of the woods? So to call out our presidents and our prime ministers, is that part of the calling of the church? Well, I think if we reach back to the scriptures, it would be hard to deny that that is part of the calling of the church, to speak truth to those with power. But that then brings us on to this question of how we use our social capital. I think churches are very good at using their social capital in kind of to develop bridges, if you like. Sometimes it's referred to as bridging capital. So the idea there is that people within those churches using their social capital in a bridging way are very good at developing kind of dialogue with equals, as it were, developing partnerships and networks that can enhance community relations. And that's to be welcomed. But the question is, does that move the dial when it comes to the church's engagement with structural injustice? The
Right.
church is called to transform the structures of injustice. Does dialogue and does do good community relations, does keeping everybody happy and included move the dial? Well, it might not. So the question there is, can the church help use its influence to address asymmetric power, to address unequal structures, to address systemic inequalities in local communities, and to develop what's sometimes referred to as a linking capital, so to link with other agencies, organisations, groups, be they other people of faith or people of goodwill who don't claim a faith, to gather together in a way akin, I suppose, to elements of broad-based community organising
That's
or
it. Yeah.
the
Yes.
practice of the civil rights movement, using the network of the church, using the relationships of the church, not just to enhance understanding and dialogue, but to actually move the dial when it comes to political inequalities and structural
Mhm.
injustice. And that, there's no easy answer. That is a challenge for many, many people of faith, because it is making the move from welfare to justice. It is saying that the church has a prophetic, I would perhaps talk about prophetic rather than political, a prophetic role to play in transforming those structures of injustice. And that means intervening on the side of those who are living in poverty. That means embodying and expressing in practice, and not just from pulpits, God's preferential option for the poor.
Right. And those that was exactly what was coming to mind to me as you were talking was definitely this faith-based community organizing and how that connects with your research, but also this ongoing commitment to being in those places where others have withdrawn, right? That's a big issue for us right now in the United States, especially in urban areas where businesses have left and churches, like as you mentioned earlier, have lost membership. And so then it's harder to afford to keep the building going. But
Yeah.
those often in those communities where that relationship capital, that social capital can be so impactful. And so how do we continue to support those congregations that are doing that needed and necessary work becomes an important question for all of us that are interested in justice issues broadly. So I can't believe it, but we've already been talking for close to an hour, and I
Oh my
wanted to
goodness.
thank you for,
Oh
I
wow.
know, and I wanted to thank
Goodness.
you for the wisdom that you're bringing. But I also, all of my podcasts kind of end with the same question, which is based on, I think, the need for all of us to embrace and not lose hope right now in the
Oh yeah.
UK and the US.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so what would you say is giving you hope right now? What is inspiring that hope within you?
Well, what's inspiring my own hope at the moment is the fact that in 10 days' time I'll be on annual leave. The
Amen to
so
that.
the hope is that the sun continues to shine when I'm on leave. No, in all seriousness, um, it is very easy. One second. It is very easy to, I think, become disillusioned in the UK and the US at the moment. Um, but I do think that there are reasons to hope. Um, and I'm hesitating because it feels, if I'm absolutely honest, certainly in a UK context, it feels harder to articulate that hope at the moment than it has for some time. Because I think the reactionary forces within religion as well as within politics are stronger than they've been for some time. Having said that, I think where I see hope is often beyond the institutional church, beyond the formal church, in the activism and the practice of people of faith, either within their local congregations or in formal or informal collaborations with other people of goodwill who are also committed to transforming structural injustice, are also committed to working for the common good, are also committed to welcoming the stranger and feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. So I think what you might call networked activism is where I see hope, where there is less concern for institutional power and more of a focus on dynamic kind of movements for social justice. Now, that ain't perfect, and I know that there are issues there. I think another area where I would find hope is in are those small moments. I talked earlier about macro, the need to challenge macro injustice, economic and political injustice. But one of the strengths of something like community building is the focus on the so-called small and
Hmm.
so-called insignificant. And I think one of the things that I've tried to do is to say that if we look at the Beatitudes, whether that's Matthew 5 or Luke 6, the slightly more politicized blessings and woes in Luke 6, we see Jesus prioritizing those whom society claims are insignificant and worthless. So what I want to say is, where are those kind of what you might call yeast or salt or light moments, those kind of breaking in moments where we see the light of the kingdom, where we see glimpses of that liberated, emancipated future. So small moments. And then I think the final area where I find hope is in a slightly different kind of direction, and that's in a UK context with the rise of the far right and right wing parties like Reform UK, where we are seeing increasing levels of xenophobia and the normalisation of racism. And in the US, where we see very similar patterns of Christian nationalism, or should we say Christian fascism, the rise of the far right, the growth of xenophobia. We've seen it, for example, it pains me to say it, during the recent Football World Cup.
Yes, we did.
And yet, where I find hope is in the fact that for a growing number of people, maybe not of our generation, but of our children's generation, diversity isn't some political badge that we wear. It's normal. It's every day.
Mhm.
It's not about kind of making some kind of right on political statement by saying, I've got friends who are A, B, C, and D. I've got Muslim friends, Christian friends, Buddhist friends, Sikh friends, Jewish friends. It's not a badge of honor. It's just normal. And certainly in our communities in the UK, in our life as a family, that's where I see hope. It's not a right on assertion of my credibility, as it were. It's just normal. Diversity isn't a problem, it's a gift from God.
Well, thank you. That is both a sharing of your hope and a prayer, I think, for the world right there, Chris.
Amen to that. Amen.
So again, thank you for this conversation.
No,
And
pleasure.
I hope that the conversation with you will continue, because I think your research really can help the church in the United States as well. So I hope this is just the
Thank you.
launching of further conversation with you. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I've enjoyed the conversation and hope it's been helpful.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Kurt.